So again, I hope you've enjoyed the singing we've done together this morning. We got one more song we'll do before we have communion, sometimes all together in droves. And he suggested that one of the reasons, and there are many reasons and many factors, but he talked about how churches fail to address level one questions because we assume that already everybody believes them. A level one question, for an example, and the one we're considering today, is there a God? And other level one questions build on that fundamental question. So you could go on and say, well, if there is a God, what is that God like? And how do we know this God? What does He want from us? How do we know there's just one? Why do we call God He? I don't imagine, as we talk about some of these questions, and I plan to do several of these level one questions in the future. I don't think we're going to address all of them, but I think we should address some of them, and I do expect to address some of them in the weeks to come. And we shouldn't expect that everyone here, and here I'm thinking virtually today, but everyone gathered is fully convinced of what many of us take for granted. And when people never hear their burning question addressed, what choice do they have but to kind of fade away into the background? Maybe thinking there's something wrong with them because they have that question. Maybe eventually they go outside the church altogether, and then years later, maybe decades later, we're talking about someone and say, yeah, they haven't been to church since they were a boy or a young man or a girl or a young woman. And it's tragedy, and it's one that none of us parents want for our children, but I think we all fear it to some degree. That's not to mention that there are many adults that will not hold on to their faith throughout the duration of their lifetime. May that never be because we were afraid to talk about, or we were just neglectful to talk about level one questions. Obviously, I don't pretend to approach this question in a neutral and detached way. If you think about the songs that we've sang together today, they obviously proclaim the greatness and the awesomeness of God that obviously assumes His existence and the reality of God. None of us approach anything that is important to us in a completely neutral way. And when we say that we do or we think that we do, we're deceived by that. Of course I believe that there's a God. And I'm going to say that most of you watching today probably do too. But there may be a few of you that have some legitimate questions. Or maybe you're a little bit new that if I answer the question in the affirmative, that was going to change my life forever. The Bible's starting point is not neutral either. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth is as loaded as a theological statement as you could have for the beginning of the world's most important book. And the biblical witness to the existence of God is obviously important. We could even say it's primary. But I don't want to fall into a kind of a circular argument here, because if you're not sure if there's a God, then you're not sure if you're going to believe the biblical witness about God. So I can't talk about that question without referring to the Bible to some degree, of course. But what I want to do is to look at this from 4 different approaches. Those approaches are going to be philosophical. The second one will be scientific. And then we'll look at the historical witness to God. And finally, I'm going to talk about faith. Now, I could have started with faith. And in some ways that would be appropriate because we can't believe in God apart from faith. I mean, that's what it means. And so I could have started there, but I want to save it for the end because I want to talk about some of these other perspectives first. And I want to say up front that none of these 4 areas am I going to have the opportunity to go very deep or go very wide. And so what I want to do is to present a cumulative case for the existence of God today. And then a little bit later we'll talk about the proper role of faith that it plays in that cumulative case. I begin with philosophy because philosophy is where these arguments are classically made. And it isn't necessarily the realm that many of you, are where your minds are. Not everyone is philosophically minded, but some of you are. I happen to be one of those people. And if we never speak to people who are philosophically minded, I think that we may miss them. They're trying to reason in their mind. They're trying to puzzle out in their mind from everything that they see. Is there really a God? And if there's a God, how can we know that? Those are philosophical questions. It is the realm of abstract ideas that have real-world consequences. So I'm going to start with a classical argument against God's existence, at least existence against the biblical God. And it has a title, it's called The Logical Argument Against God. And you'll see why it is important to engage the matter in the philosophical realm. So this is a guy by the name of Epicurus. Some of you may have heard of him before. He's a late BC philosopher. And he presented it like this many years ago. He says, is God willing to prevent evil but not able? Then he is not omnipotent. Is he able but not willing? Then he is malevolent. Is he both able and willing? Then whence cometh evil? We might translate that. Where does evil come from? Is he neither able nor willing? Then why call him God? It's a powerful philosophical argument. It's been around for many years. It has come in many different forms. Now, if you have an argument against the existence of God like this, or again, at least the existence of the biblical God, as is understood in the Bible, then you need to be able to defeat a claim like that by proving that it is logically possible for there to be a loving, all-powerful, all-knowing God, and at the same time, there be evil in the world. Most famously, in the 20th century, Alvin Plantinga answered this argument by answering that an all-powerful, all-loving God could allow evil to exist as a result or as a consequence of free will. In other words, if this God in the Bible, as we understand him, believed that there was something valuable, even if it caused the potential for evil, if there was something better about the existence of free will, that he would allow it, even with the necessary potential for evil. Well, Plantinga's argument was successful, it was effective in answering the logical argument against God. Now, certainly Plantinga's argument has in turn been answered. That's the way these things work. You know, that he formulates a response and someone else will too. But the point is not to chase down all these different rabbit holes. Rather, what I want to say right now is I want to make the point that the question of God's existence has always been at the heart of philosophical discussions. And many effective arguments for God's existence have been made. I want to talk about Thomas Aquinas for a moment, and he was a 13th century theologian, also a student of Aristotelian philosophy. So Aristotle, who came a long time before, probably sometime around the days of Epicurus, long time before Aquinas. But Aquinas wanted to use Aristotle's philosophy in theological arguments. And so that's kind of what he was about. And he came up with 5 famous arguments for God's existence. And one famous example is the argument from motion. That is that nothing is put into motion without something else putting it into motion. If I move my hand like I just did there, you know I put it into motion. And so the idea is that everything that has ever moved was put into motion by something else. But you cannot just infinitely regress. Eventually you have to arrive at the first one who put things into motion. And he called this, Aquinas did, the immovable mover. And obviously, that unmoved mover who put everything else into motion, we would identify as God, as did Aquinas. And there are many other philosophical arguments for the existence of God. I'd encourage you to just Google Aquinas' 5 arguments for God, and you could go and look at each of those in summary form, and I think you would find each of them to be as convincing as this unmoved mover argument. But one philosophical argument that Aquinas made that also overlaps with scientific arguments is the argument from design. So the intelligent design argument in our society has been a controversial flashpoint, and it's gotten wrapped up in some of the battles about education and what was going to happen in the classroom. I'm not trying to say anything negative about that. I'm just thinking, I think that sometimes because it did become so political and so controversial, that there is a really good argument there that might have gotten hurt or lost in those arguments. So in bringing the ID or the intelligent design argument up, I'm not commenting on the intelligent design movement that was very popular beginning of this century, maybe the late 90s or so. In fact, long before the intelligent design movement, Aquinas, again, 13th century scholar, argued that the natural universe showed evidence of intentional and purposeful design. And if that is true, then of course it points to an intelligent designer. The argument is powerful and it's simple to follow. Recently I was at the park with Katie, and underneath our picnic table was a pile of rocks. You'll see this on the slide. That's not the actual pile of rocks, but it gives an idea of what we were looking at. And she just made some comment, drawing attention to it, like, well, look, there's a pile of rocks, down there. Or someone made a pile of rocks here underneath our picnic table. And I made some kind of tongue-in-cheek comment along the lines of, nah, these rocks got here by accident and they just put themselves into a pile. And of course, we both knew my statement was absurd, but I was making a point. There was no chance that the pile of rocks randomly made itself. Someone who had to be reasonably intelligent, in this case that could even be a toddler, but someone who thought, hey, I'm going to pile these rocks up, had to have made the pile with intention. In fact, I'll go out on a limb and say that if you gave nature 1 billion years, that pile of rocks still could never come about on its own without an intelligent designer. How much more complex is this universe that we live in, that we inhabit, not to mention our planet and the complexity of biological life? Take, for example, the expansion of our universe. If it expands too slowly, it cannot form the stars that are necessary to support a solar system like ours, to support life. And if it expands too fast, then there can be no planets. I don't pretend to understand all of this. You can see on the slide that I'm talking about Hugh Ross, who is a world-class astrophysicist. And he speaks about the fine-tuning of the expansion, the necessary fine-tuning for the expansion of the universe, for it to be just right, so that we could have this world that we inhabit and take for granted. And this is what he says about it. He says it exceeds a factor of more than 1 million quadrillion. That's 6 times, I believe. Times the best engineering achievements of the human race, which is quite a bit more than a pile of rocks. There's a reason why people, particularly unbelievers, posit the idea of infinite universes. Because the only way that you can have a universe, if you want to say that it randomly became what it became, the only way you can have a universe like ours is you would have to have an infinite amount of universes in order to get one that is like ours. Sounds a bit far-fetched. To take one more example from Hugh Ross, he argues that for even one planet in this universe to be as suited for the life as well as ours, he says falls below 1 in 10 to, and I apologize I couldn't put the little subscript there, but that's 1 in 10 to the 1,000th power. Stated another way, it is at least 10 to the 850th power times more remote than the possibility that a blindfolded person could pick out a single marked electron roughly shuffled into a tightly packed pile of electrons that fills the entire universe on the first try. So don't let any atheist tell you that they don't need faith to believe that our universe and our planet is how it is. And these are just a couple of examples. And we haven't even begun to deal with the miracle of biological life. Long before people understood just how finely tuned our universe was for life on this planet, the Apostle Paul wrote in Romans 1, 18 through 20, he said, the wrath of God is being revealed. I think we got that slide up there, don't we? Yeah, the wrath of God is being revealed for heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness, since what may be known about God is plain to them, because God has made it plain to them. For since the creation of the world, God's invisible qualities, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood from what has been made, so that people are without excuse. So what is Paul saying? That all people can see the evidence of God's eternal and divine nature spans the universe, quite literally. You would have to be out on a limb that far in order for it to be true that this universe could exist without a God. We need to certainly have discussions in church, I think in youth groups, and even from the pulpit, about things the issues that deal with the age of the earth. These are controversial issues, I realize that. The age of the earth, the universe, the theory of evolution, how all of this relates to the creation story of the Bible. It's beyond the scope of my sermon today to do that. But here I can say this: let's respect others who have a different position on some of these matters where we can at least agree that there is a God and that He must be pretty great for us to live in this universe and the world that we do. And that God has not stayed distant from His creation. He has, in fact, intervened in history. I'm not going to say too much about the argument for God's existence from history today. It may be the most important of these categories that we've talked about so far. But the reason why I'm going to save a little bit of kind of our ammunition for that topic is I want to talk about it more in the future when I speak about Jesus Christ as the ultimate, fullest revelation of God's intervention in history. I just want to sketch out a few things for our consideration today. It is so important to know that the biblical witness to God is far different than the claims of other religions from the ancient Near East, from biblical times. The God of the Bible was not identified with ambiguous stories and a mythical past, but rather intervened in the lives of people, and real historical situations. And not only this, but Israel claimed their very existence is due to the miraculous intervention of God against a historical king from Egypt, so that God's deeds testify to who He is. Deuteronomy 4:34 says, "Has any God ever tried to take for himself one nation out of another nation by testings, by signs and wonders, by war, by a mighty hand and an outstretched arm, or by great and awesome deeds like all the things the Lord your God did for you in Egypt before your very eyes?" The answer to that question is a resounding no. Certainly, there were stories about other gods of other nations, but they were rooted in a mythical past. Israel is the only nation who told their story about the God who redeemed them, about the God who walked beside them, and the God who held them accountable. Everything about them was related to who their God was. He's the God who made promises to them, and then we saw those promises kept. Most importantly, God made a promise that through the great historical King David, that He would bring His ultimate King, His Messiah, His Son, into the world, as we know as Jesus Christ. And the hinge upon which all history is, how science discovers the marvels of God's creation, which testify to God's eternal nature and power. And then finally, we've touched on how God has been made manifest through the events of history up to the present day. And it's an impressive case, but I want to tell you that it means nothing apart from faith. That you cannot believe in God, even with all that, if you do not have faith. Faith utilizes reason. Faith is reasonable, but faith is not limited by reason. Hebrews 11:1 says, "Faith is the confidence in what we hope for, an assurance about what we do not see." For the person who seeks certainty in the place of faith, they will be forever seeking and not finding. Faith is not certainty. It is a quality that goes beyond certainty because it requires our commitment before it reveals its wonders. It isn't a blind faith like that required of atheists. In fact, it is reasonable in light of what we can discover in philosophy, in science, and history, to believe that there is a God who has made Himself known, most especially in the person of Jesus Christ. We can only taste the fruit of that faith through commitment. Certainty is different because it relies on a different method. It is achieved not by faith, it is achieved by skepticism. I think the most famous example of that is René Descartes. And René Descartes wasn't trying to harm the faith when he did this, but he ended up doing it in ways that are far more reaching than I can explain today. But René Descartes it got into this meditation in which he wanted to arrive at the only certain thing that he could think of. And so by doing that, he had to doubt everything that he could in his world. He had to doubt every aspect of reality until he came down to one fundamental truth. And you know what it is. You've heard it whether you're a student of philosophy or not. I think, therefore I am. But Descartes erred, because our existence is not the fundamental reality of the universe. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. See, nothing is more fundamental, nothing is more real than God. And we do not arrive at that point through doubting reality, but by embracing reality through faith. One verse I memorized as a child in the old King James Version. It's just one of the, I had to memorize the verses all the time when I was a kid, but very few of them stuck with me throughout my life. But for some reason, Hebrews 11:6 did. But without faith it is impossible to please Him. For he that cometh to God must believe that He is, and that He is a rewarder of them who diligently seek Him. See, if you're simply going to refuse to believe, unless you can be convinced of something with a sort of certitude that would be impossible when it comes to faith in God, then you're not going to believe. He has given witness and testimony to Himself. But don't think for a moment that somehow that puts you on more solid ground than the one who does believe in God. Now, that's quite different than, hey, I got doubts and I got to wrestle with those doubts. I think that's almost a mechanism of faith. In order for my faith to grow, I've got to wrestle with the doubts that I have. I'm not saying that we should be ashamed or afraid to honestly wrestle with doubts. But it is another thing altogether to give in to cynicism and to refuse to believe apart from certainty. One day we will have certainty, but it'll be when we see God face to face. And until that day, faith illuminates our way through this life. I can tell you myself, and I know many others, many of you at home watching can testify to this too, that there is no better way to live life than with God at your side. Not only does He exist, but He knows you, and He loves you, and He invites you into a personal relationship with Him, with the Creator of the universe. And He does so through Jesus Christ. It doesn't get any better than that. We're going to have another song at this time, and you know, as we do, we'll then come back and have a moment for communion and a closing prayer.